For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark VanGessel. I'm at the University of Delaware. I'm located down at Georgetown at a research and education center, and do a lot of I cover the state of Delaware, primarily for agronomic and commercial vegetables. And so I'm going to just kind of give you an update on some of the things we've been working on the last couple of years, some of the things that you should be aware of that might be coming down the pike, particularly as it relates to certain weed species. Just going to talk about a couple of resources that are out there, make you aware of them. Talk about, you probably haven't heard about this weed species at all, so I thought I might introduce it to you. It was a joke, bad one. Talk a little bit about corn, soybeans, some comments about PPO herbicides, and then finish up with on other issues on weed resistance. First thing though, there is now a new weed management guide put out by the colleagues in the Mid-Atlantic states. For years, Ron Ritter put out what he called EB 237, an agronomic weed management guide. We being the collective group from Penn State, University of Delaware, University of Maryland, Virginia Tech, and West Virginia, have gone together to produce this multi-crop guide. It's got corn, sorghum, small grains, soybeans, legumes, and grass hay and pastures in there. It's got a range of efficacy tables where we list the most common weeds for our area, the commonly used herbicides, and where the rank of those products are. We do that for burn down, we do that for early season pre-emergence weeds, as well as post-emergence. The other thing that's really useful in this guide is with all this number of prepackaged mixes out there, what is in a prepackaged mix? This gives you an idea. This tells you what's in them, and if you use it at a certain rate, what's the components of that bringing to you. So those are very helpful, as well as our comments based on what we've seen in our research plots. It's available. Unfortunately, like everything else, we've gone to having to sell these. I'm not sure the way it's set up in Maryland, but
I'm gonna order some. If anybody wants any, let me know today, and I'm gonna place an order. But it will be $20. $20, or it's also available. So it's available as a hard copy. See Jenny. It's also available as a PDF for those of you who want to have it on a tablet in the field. It's available as a PDF through this website at Penn State. If you either Google Mid-Atlantic Weed Management Guide or Google their number, this website will come up. If you want the cheapo version, it's available here at the University of Delaware under our weed management guides. It's a cheap, free PDF. However, because it is cheap, you can't search it. So if you're looking for information specifically on field pansy or Johnny Jump Up, you have to look page by page to do it. You can't do a find command and search for it. That's what you get when you don't pay for it. But it's a very useful guide. Jenny, what about these? Do you have? I have some in my office.
Okay, so see Jenny about these as well. These are very useful charts on herbicide mechanism of action and the classification. It's listed here with the numbers. Oops. It's listed here with the mechanism of action number. Those are the numbers we're seeing on their pesticide containers, grouping them by their mechanism of action. So all those herbicides that kill weeds in the same way are grouped together. It gives you what herbicides are grouped together. It gives it by their family, by the active ingredient, as well as by product name. So what is Reflex? It'll tell you Reflex is fomosafe, and it's a group 14. It's a PPO herbicide. Trying to avoid resistant, don't use another group 14. With all the premixes out there, it has on the right-hand side of the chart all of our common premixes in this area and what is in them. And not only by active ingredient, but also by trade name and by group number. A really useful tool. It's a nice, big, colorful chart. This one's free. See Jenny about getting a copy of it. It's being done in cooperation with the U.S. Soybean Board, and the Maryland Soybean Board is also participating in this project. This might be a little hard to see with the lights though, but that's a weed sticking, one solitary weed growing up in the middle of a field. And you know, for years we've talked about there is a threshold with weeds. We don't need 100% weed control to maintain optimum yield. Okay? That story's changing now. When you have this weed, Palmer amaranth, in a field, that we have gotten in a situation with this particular species being so aggressive that we can't tolerate these weeds going to seed, even a single one. And why is that? First of all, Palmer amaranth versus our smooth pigweed, right? How do we tell the difference? First and foremost, if you're not sure, treat it like Palmer and be aggressive on it. Don't worry about identifying, assume it's Palmer in your heat of the battle. However, the best way of telling the two apart is that Palmer amaranth has no hairs on the stems and the petioles. Palmer amaranth has no hairs. Redwood or smooth has hairs up and down the stem, up and down the petioles, and that's true on seedlings. I know a lot of people talk about, well, the length of the petioles, you know, the length of the petiole versus the length of the leaf blade. If it's only got 3 or 4 leaves on, it's going to be hard to tell what the length of that petiole is. And by the time that plant gets large enough where you can separate the length of the petiole, you probably missed that window to spray it. So look for the hairs. If it has no hairs, it's Palmer amaranth. If your eyesight isn't good enough, assume it's Palmer amaranth and treat it accordingly. But why is that? Why are we saying, you know, this is the big new mean guy on the block? One is, it's a species that developed in the Sonora Desert in the Southwest. It tolerates heat and drought really well. It has an extensive root system to capture what little moisture there might be in the soil. Its optimum temperature for photosynthesis is well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, you think about our corn and sorghum, where they shut off photosynthesis in the 90-degree range. You know, so it's while our corn sorghum have shut down, Palmer amaranth is still growing. And it can grow very, very rapidly. The other thing about it, it produces a tremendous number of seeds. A single female will produce up to 500,000 seeds when it's growing in combination with other plants. Put it under ideal conditions, it'll produce well over 1 million seeds. So it produces a lot of seeds. It's a dioecious plant. It's a nice academic term. Dioecious meaning it has separate male and female plants. The male produces the pollen that spreads over thousands of feet to the female plants. If it has resistance, a lot of time those resistant genes are is a male trait. It's moving in that pollen, moving thousands of feet from field to field and spreading resistance really quickly. So it's another reason why it's a plant of concern. We do have some benefits though. I mean, there are some traits that help us with management. While it produces a tremendous number of seeds, the seeds are not really long-lived in the soil. 2 to 3 years of good management will drive that seed bank down. You'll start to see some impacts on it. So that's a plus, if there is such a thing. So you got year one, you got one plant, it's way on the other side of the field. Soybeans are waist high, I'll worry about it later. Okay, that one plant went to seed. The next year with 500,000 seeds going into the soil, you got a nice decent sized patch in that area. You go out and you spray it with Roundup. You spray it with Roundup. Spray it with Roundup. And then I'm going to throw PPO on it or anything else on it to kill it. Well, it's 10, 12 inches tall now. You're not going to kill it. So in 3 or 4 years, this one plant that went to a patch like this is spread throughout the field. So removing those small plants, a few plants, is going to save headaches down the road. And not just pulling them up, but taking them out of the field. This is down in Georgia. You know, we don't grow too many peanuts up here, but this is from Georgia, where they are routinely now hand weeding their fields. But if you take this single plant, when it has a mature seed head, pull it up, throw it down on the ground, you haven't done anything as far as stopping seeds from going into the soil. You've just made that patch from being large to small, but you haven't stopped seed production. So, got to take it out of the field, throw it in an area where it's not going to be a problem for you. The other thing about it is, most of the, not all, but a good percentage of those seeds remain intact on the plant. So pulling it up and walking across the field, you're not spreading a path of seed as you go. Certainly not like if you were doing lamb's quarter. Lamb's quarter, once that seed's mature, you look at it wrong and it drops its seed. Okay, Palmer amaranth, most of the seed will remain on the plant. So pulling it across the field, you're not just leaving yourself a trail with it. Now, when we've got Palmer amaranth, some of our recommendations have always and this holds true not only for Palmer amaranth, but a lot of other problem species. Plant into a clean seed bed. Make sure it's clean at planting, whether that's through tillage or an effective burn down herbicide. Using an effective soil applied herbicide at planting, not 3-4 weeks before planting, but at planting using your residual herbicides. Using multiple modes of action. You hear this all the time. Use multiple modes of action. What they don't say is effective multiple modes of action. Rotating modes of action that aren't effective on Palmer amaranth isn't helping you for resistance management. You got to make sure that that herbicide you're rotating with is effective on Palmer amaranth. And if you have Palmer amaranth in your area, and in your field, never apply glyphosate by itself because there's a really good chance that Palmer amaranth is resistant to glyphosate. Post-emergence, you know, we do have some good tools to control Palmer amaranth post-emergence, provided they're applied to small Palmer amaranth, 3 inches or less. You know, we don't have a tool that will control Palmer amaranth that's this tall. We just don't have it. So spraying it while it's small. And what does that mean? You're in May, June, July, you've got 10,000 things on your mind. What does that mean? About 3 weeks after you spray your pre-emergence herbicide, you need to be thinking about spraying that with Palmer amaranth with a post-emergence herbicide. Our studies, we consistently go out about 4 weeks to the day of when we sprayed our pre, followed by our post 4 weeks later, and we consistently get good control of Palmer amaranth. We wait till 5 weeks after we sprayed those pre's, we start losing control because it's growing too fast. So you have a narrow window in there that you have opportunities to spray it. We need to conserve some of our herbicide groups as well. You know, not just rotating modes of action, but what's in there as well is not using some modes of action that we need. Okay, if you're growing a vegetable crop, okay, and you're relying on group 2 herbicides like Sandia or Pursuit or Raptor, which is a mode of action that tends to develop resistance. You want to make sure you conserve it for those vegetables. And so not using that group of action in rotational crops when you have good alternatives. And limit weed seed production, stopping it from going to seed. Rotations are very important in managing Palmer amaranth. And some of these fields that have really bad problems, I think we have much better control options using corn than we do in soybeans. Here's an example of a guy who had pretty bad Palmer amaranth. When he sprayed his corn, his boom hung over into his soybeans. See, he killed his soybeans, but he noticed he also has got very good control of Palmer amaranth. So we do have some options here for post-emergent spray. And if you're in a situation where you're trying to get back on your feet from Palmer amaranth, corn would be an option to go with. So I'm going to come back to Palmer amaranth throughout the rest of my talk because it's one species I have in a lot of my plots. But what I wanted to do was just kind of talk a little bit about some different approaches for corn and then into soybeans for weed management. You know, for no-till weed management, it's important that we use a burn down. Oh, excuse me, conventional. Conventional. We don't need burn downs usually with our conventional tillage corn because we're plowing, disking just before plant and we're controlling it. But because we are tilling right before we plant, we've just mechanically scarified a lot of that weed seeds. And we end up with quite a flush of weeds right at planting. And as a result, we often need a pretty good residual program to control that huge flush of weeds coming up right after planting. And you know, as much as we'd love to be able to spray once at planting and be done, if we've got problem weeds like Palmer amaranth or oftentimes morning glory, that pre-emergence herbicide isn't carrying us through and we need to come back post-emergence. You know, some of our pre-emergence herbicides that we've got, the Group 215, the Group 15 herbicides like metolachlor, S-metolachlor, pyroxsulfone, acetochlor, plus atrazine have been very standard herbicides for us and have worked very well in a number of situations. We've got a lot of newer products that have come on the market in the last few years for pre-emergence applications. A lot of these are premixes that have incorporated this Group 27 herbicides like asaxaflutol or mesotrione. You know, some of the trade names here are Balance Flex and Corvus, Lumax Lexar. I'm going to talk about Acuron and Resicor in a minute, you know, and Instigate. These tend to be a little bit more premium price products, but if you're in situations where you're trying to get away with a single application at planting, these tend to do a better job for it than just using the chloracetamides with a triazine. On the other hand, if you're coming back and you know you have to spray post-emergence because you've got heavy weed pressure, you've got Palmer amaranth, what have you, these may not be necessary because you know you're going to come back post-emergence in most cases. Post-emergence, you know, approach for post-emergence, particularly when you have Palmer amaranth in your field. Like we said, if you got Roundup Ready corn, we know glyphosate's not controlling that Palmer amaranth. We need something with that glyphosate that, one, will effectively control Palmer amaranth that's up, and two, provide some good residual control. You know, what we have found that fits that bill very nicely is the mesotrione or Callisto in combination with atrazine. Provides both the post as well as residual activity. Status fits in that situation, although it's not one that's going to give us residual control, particularly in areas where you might have vegetables. Another option would be Impact plus atrazine. Impact does not have the carryover restriction that we see with Callisto if you're in vegetables. We also have some options if you're not growing Roundup Ready corn, but conventional corn, using you know, atrazine plus Callisto, atrazine plus Status. If you've got grasses present, the Impact. Notice, you know, there's a lot of products that are not included in this chart. Part of it is because we're focusing on Palmer amaranth, and a lot of our Palmer amaranth is resistant to Group 2 herbicides or the ALS inhibiting herbicides, and they won't control a lot of this Palmer amaranth. They do have a good fit in areas where Palmer amaranth is not a concern. For no-till, you know, we're looking at, again, remember we started off with our management starting clean at planting, using a good burn down, whether that might be paraquat with a triazine like simazine or atrazine, or glyphosate plus 2,4-D. You know, I think of our corn approaches as a lot of cases needing either 3 passes or 2 passes. 3 passes tend to be more consistent for us for weed control. And they provide residual control later into the season. 2 passes, obviously we got fewer application timings, less application cost. However, if you're trying to reduce your passes down to 2, timing becomes much more critical. Your choice of products becomes much more limited as well. You know, thinking of the 3-pass approach. You know, your first pass is 2 to 3 weeks before planting, going out with a burn down, maybe using a residual control. You know, I was just looking at the poster in there about the cover crops in Queen Anne's County and being #1 in the state. We're going to need to burn down a lot of those cover crops. We've got some concerns, depending on what cover crop you have, as to whether a lot of tank mixes are going to reduce the effectiveness. In most cases, you know, glyphosate, we got rye out there and some of these other cover crops, ryegrass in some scenarios. Many cases like that, adding a triazine with our glyphosate for burn downs can reduce the effectiveness of it. In some cases, it may be wise to go out with just your non-selective herbicide and follow with your residuals at planting. With that 3-pass program, that second pass is made at planting. You know, a lot of times if you've set your planter up with your row cleaners real aggressively, you're moving quite a bit of soil. If you made that herbicide application prior to planting, those trash whippers are moving a lot of that treated soil right out of the row. And it's not uncommon to see a nice green ribbon right down the row where that treated soil got moved out. So if you're setting your planters up to move a lot of soil, that pre-emergence herbicide application should be made after you plant, after that soil's been moved. And then our third pass is usually made about 4 weeks. Plan on 4 weeks. Don't put it off any later if you got Palmer amaranth after that second application was made. You know, again, we know we're coming back with 3 passes. We know we're going to use a post-emergence herbicide. You know, a lot of these chlorocetamide herbicides plus atrazine fit really well. Again, S-metolachlor, pyroxylphone, acetochlor. I get asked a lot, well, why not just go out with atrazine then? Problem is, if we start relying just on atrazine, we could start to see resistance develop to that, particularly in cases where we have Palmer amaranth. These metolachlors, pyroxylphone, acetochlor, really do a decent job. They may not be great, but they do a decent job on Palmer amaranth. And that can help us preserve the longevity of atrazine on Palmer amaranth. So that's why we recommend one of these chlorocetamides to go out with atrazine. Post-emergence, a lot of the same comments as we saw with conventional tilled corn. You know, a lot of us are growing Roundup Ready corn, so we got glyphosate for post-emergence. If you got Palmer amaranth in the area, don't use glyphosate by itself. If you've got morning glories in your field, going out with some atrazine post-emergence to help with morning glory control and provide you some residual control. And when I say some more atrazine, morning glory is your primary problem. You ought to be looking at about a pound and a quarter to a pound and a half atrazine post-emergence to control it. With our 2-pass program, going out with a burn down and maybe a limited residual control up front, and making that second pass no longer than 3 weeks after the burn down. So you don't have as much of a window there between your burn down application and your post. You know, you're often looking to use a product that gives you significant residual control, because when you're coming in on relatively small corn, we're talking 2 to 3 collar corn, you're still going to be 2 to 4 weeks before that canopy develops. And you're going to need some residual herbicide to help you out carry that into canopy closure. You know, so that early post, 1, 2, 3 collar corn is usually no later than 3 weeks after planting. You don't want to wait much longer than that. And the reason for that is is that corn starts to develop that the number of ears and rows real early in its development. And weed competition, while corn is in the V4 to V5 stage, can impact the ear development down the road. So even if you come in, get excellent weed control after that stage, you've already hurt yields. So you want to go in early before that corn starts to lay down the early ear development, remove weed competition, and again, you're still quite a ways from canopy closure, so you need some residual activity. You know, Halix GT is an option there that we've looked at. It contains glyphosate, dual, callisto, and atrazine. There are some other products that fit in that category, but they do need to have both good post-emergence activity and provide some residual control for you. Soybeans. Okay. Just want to mention to you, there's a product that we've used a lot over in Delaware. I'm sure you've been using it here a lot. The Canopy, the Canopy DF. They have now come out with a new formulation of it. It's a less concentrated version, so it's you're actually using more of this Canopy blend than we used to use with our Canopy DF. And why I mention that is Canopy contains metribuzin, and we've got to be careful about our metribuzin rates. So if we get too high on our metribuzin rates, we can cause some injury to our soybeans. So if someone says, what rate of Canopy are you using, and they say X amount, make sure you know which formulation they're referring to and which one you're going to spray, so you don't spray too high of a rate of metribuzin on your soybeans. The ratio is the same between the chlorimiron and metribuzin, it's just we're using a different ratio. So 6.5 ounces of Canopy blend is the same as 5 ounces of the old Canopy DF. On the other hand, you don't want to spray Canopy DF at 6.5 ounces. That's going to be too hot on a lot of your soils. So make sure you know which formulation you're using. All right, talking about no-till soybeans here. You know, kind of our standard approach for no-till soybeans over the years has been going out with a non-selective herbicide, usually glyphosate or paraquat in some cases, often using 2,4-D with it, and a full rate of a residual herbicide, and then coming back post-emergence to control any weeds that might have come up. For a number of years, that worked really well for us, but there's been, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been getting more and more calls about this program not working. You know, and so this is kind of the approach a lot of we're going out about 4 weeks before they plant, 3 to 4 weeks before they plant, spray their burn down of a non-selective 2,4-D and your full rate of residual herbicide. Full rate of your residual herbicide is starting to break down then about 4 weeks after you use it. So right about the time you're planting your corn, you start getting weed breaks. Then you're waiting late, so you only have to make one post-emergence application, and coming in and spraying, and you're not getting the control of those summer annual weeds you like, particularly things like morning glory and now Palmer amaranth. So to compensate for that, we've been kind of shifting these burn down applications closer and closer to planting, so that residual herbicide is carrying us further into the season, so we can get better control of our post-emergence applications. The problem is, we're not getting as good of control with those summer or those winter annual weeds like mare's tail and field pansy and so on. And this is what's going on. This is a field there at the Research and Education Center that we were going to go into soybeans, and went out and took some pictures with our highly sophisticated quantitative measurement for height right here on this Palmer amaranth, or excuse me, this mare's tail, and it was 4 to 6 inches tall. This is 4 weeks before we intended to plant. We went back to that same clump 1 week before we intended to plant. And here's our nice little measurement tool right there. That mare's tail is now 10 to 12 inches tall. So in that 3-week period, our weeds got a lot larger. It doesn't show up real well here, but down here you can't see things like field pansy and henbit because they're small. They're all going to flower in this picture here. So it's not just mare's tail, but it's other winter annual weeds as well. We complicate that with the fact that if we went out 4 weeks before we planted, this mare's tail was going to be smaller, and we could use a full pound acid equivalent or a quart rate of 2,4-D. But if we delay that to 1 week before planting, our maximum rate of 2,4-D is only going to be a half a pound. Okay? This particular field is really coarse textured, so we weren't able to use sharpen in that case. So by shifting that burn down application closer to planting, our weeds are larger and we can use less of our 2,4-D, which is doing the bulk of the lifting on mare's tail. Couple that with these fields that where we now are seeing Palmer amaranth in it, and we know we need that residual control, that a lot of these fields, if you're having problems, consider 2 applications, one for a burn down, which would be just your glyphosate or paraquat, 2,4-D, whatever, and then making your residual application at planting. This is going out controlling your mare's tail and a lot of your winter annuals. That pre-emergence application made at planting is providing residual control for your Palmer amaranth. So now when you're coming in with your post-emergent spray, you're spraying 2 to 3 inch tall weeds instead of 6 or 7 inch tall weeds. With our soybeans, I just want to talk a little bit about PPO herbicides. We are using a lot more of our PPO herbicides or our group 14s in soybeans because of Palmer amaranth. All right? There are reports out of Tennessee and Mississippi where they have PPO resistant Palmer amaranth. So we've got to be careful that we don't overuse this mode of action and develop resistance in our area. Some of the products that contain PPO herbicides in soybeans, Aim and Cadet, all the Authority products, Ultra Blazer, Cobra, Reflex, Valor, Sharpen. And here's all the premixes that contain PPO herbicides, from Euphoria to Broadax and Trivence. So in a soybean rotation, we could conceivably be going out with Sharpen early pre-plant, using either Valor or Authority at planting, and then coming back with Reflex, Cobra, or Ultra Blazer post-emergence, and just sprayed that same field with three times, all relying on PPO herbicides. That's not a good scenario. This is another one of those cases where we have to choose our best options and avoid overuse of specific modes of action. I'm going to skip through this real quick because there is one I really want to mention too. We talked about Palmer amaranth. We talked a little bit about mare's tail. Those are not the only resistance issues we need to be concerned about. Okay? We've had lamb's quarter resistance for years, since the early 70s. We've had smooth and red root pigweed resistance for a number of years. But we also have had some issues come up with common ragweed that I want you to be aware of. This is a field near Georgetown, Delaware. This was back in 2000, where the guy had been planting continuous soybeans, been using group 2 and group 14 herbicides year after year, and developed resistance to those herbicides. Fortunately, he switched and has been getting very good control in that field since then. We've been going by this area consistently and never seen any other fields infested in it. So we knew that this was possible in the area, but we just hadn't seen it spread very much. Hadn't seen it spread at all. However, I got a number of phone calls this year. One from Maryland on the Eastern Shore, a couple from New Jersey, saw a couple fields in Delaware where the fields were sprayed with glyphosate and the common ragweed did not die. So we took some of that into the greenhouse and sprayed it. And that's what common ragweed ought to look like in the greenhouse when you spray it with Reflex, with glyphosate, or with first rate. However, this common ragweed got sprayed with Reflex, glyphosate, and first rate at a 1x rate, a 2x rate, and a 4x rate. We repeated this experiment. This time we had some extra plants. We took and put a 2x rate of first rate, 2x rate of reflex, and 2x rate of glyphosate in the same jug, sprayed it, and we had some of these plants survive. Not a good situation. This is from up in New Jersey. No one believes me when I tell them this, but we couldn't get all the seed to germinate of common ragweed. So we're only able to spray it with a 1x and a 2x rate. But again, reflex, glyphosate, first rate, none of those killed this population. So we can't just focus on Palmer amaranth right now. We've got to conserve what limited herbicides we have, not only for Palmer amaranth, but for other problem species like this. And common ragweed is one that we need to be aware of. I talked a lot about herbicides today. One of the things that on the research side in our program over in Delaware, starting to look a lot more at these cover crops for weed control. A lot of the work that's been done with cover crops has been on the organic side. You know, we're looking at it as where do cover crops, where's the mesh between cover crops and herbicides have the best fit for resistance management. Looking a lot at rye, looking a lot at some of the legumes like crimson clover and hairy vetch, and finding where we can have a nice fit to help with resistance management. With that, any questions? So questions is about Liberty Link. And yeah, I didn't include that in there. We've done a lot of work with with Liberty Link over the years. Liberty Link soybeans for Palmer amaranth is a pretty good option for us. Liberty Link soybeans allow us to use Liberty over the top of it, but it much like reflex and all of our other options, it's got to be sprayed to small weeds, 3 to 4 inches tall max. Liberty Link does not provide residual control, so we know Palmer amaranth continues to germinate over a long period of time. Often need to tank mix an additional herbicide with Liberty to provide that residual control. Products like Outlook or Warrant, tank mixing reflex with Liberty is another way of getting that residual activity out of Liberty, with a Liberty Link soybean. And with that common ragweed, Liberty is about the only option this guy's going to have on his field if he's going to soybeans is using Liberty Link soybeans. None of the other conventional herbicides are going to control it effectively. Yes, so for those who didn't hear that, we were talking about 2,4-D, and he's bringing up an excellent point. You've got to know where you're using, not only where you're using it, but who's around you, and not just next to you, because that stuff can move. That you got to be good neighbors and be responsible when you're using 2,4-D and dicamba. Good point.